Well, I just want to welcome people here today during OE week. Thanks so much for joining us today. This is going to be a little bit of a different session, I think, from maybe other ones you'll have attended this week. This is going to be a conversation today, and you may not hear the words OE or open education as much. Um, when you hear the words copyright and when you hear some of the discussions, we're sort of right. What we're going to be doing in this conversation is looking at how we can bridge the Western concept of copyright, which and open education and our licensing and so on is all part of that, with First Nations knowledge. And so we have some guests here today, and we're going to be engaged in a conversation. We're going to be talking a little bit about what we're doing at Sask Polytechnic to try to bridge that gap. And I'll mention that this is all inspired by a particular book called Earth Elder Stories, told by Alexander Wolf, which we do have a copy of in the library. And we're going to be telling you a little bit about that story and where it's come from and how it came to our attention. So to start out with, I have an offering here of some cloth and some tobacco that I'm going to be making to one of our guests today. So we're joined today by Andrea Jonasson, who is one of our instructors at Sask Polytechnic, and by Harvey Knight, who was actually one of the people behind the book. He wrote the preface for the book, and he's going to be telling us a little bit about the history of it and how we move forward. So, Harvey, welcome today, and please accept this gift from Sask Polytechnic. We're providing you this gift in exchange for better understanding of this history and how we can move forward.
Thank you. Okay.
So we are situated today on Treaty 6 territory in Prince Albert, and Sask Polytechnic is located on both Treaty 4 and Treaty 6 territory in Saskatchewan. And we want to acknowledge the peoples of this land, that this is both treaty territory and it's the homeland of the Métis as well. And we appreciate the welcome that we've received on this land and that we continue to receive, and particularly today, as we explore the relationship that's the foundation for those treaties. So during the session today, anybody is welcome to pose questions as we're moving forward. This is a discussion, but it's including you as well in the discussion. So if you do have questions, we're having a little tiny bit of a technical glitch. So there will be somebody who will be monitoring the chat and who will bring forward those questions. So it might be a couple stages before we get to your questions, but you're welcome to introduce them, and we'll introduce those into the discussion as we move forward. So I hope you'll participate in the discussion as well. You're welcome to. All right, so maybe we'll get started. And I thought maybe a good way to start would be to invite Harvey to talk a little bit about how we got this book, which was published in 1987, and where it's come from.
Well, thank you. First of all, that gives away a lot about my age. I'm 73 years old, and so I've been around for a while. And in the 80s was the time when I was probably the height of my learning from the elders. And 70s too was a very heady time of learning for me, as a cultural revolution going on there. But Alex Wolf, and of course I mentioned Danny Musko is another one of my great teachers. He adopted me as his son, Alex Wolf as well. So yeah, I just wanted to mention when you offered me this cloth and this tobacco, it's a protocol that is used in our communities amongst our leaders and elders and people who want to learn something, want to gain wisdom and knowledge about things. And in all of our ceremonies, cloth and offerings are brought to these ceremonies, and to the elders and to the storytellers. And this is very good. Thank you for doing that. And before the show started here, I did a prayer. I said a prayer, and so which is kind of a no-no, or not to do, or not. We don't record our prayers, and don't record our prayers and songs that are uh, specific to ceremonies and specific to sacred situations. So I did the prayer and everything. So that was all that. And Donna just represented me just as to show you, I guess, this is how it's done. So anytime you need to learn something or want to learn something from an elder, it's a good idea to present tobacco and a cloth of some sort. But the really important item you want to present is the tobacco itself. And usually the size of the tobacco is the amount that he's going to put in his pipe, and he's going to smoke that amount. That's good enough. And moving on to the next part of the topic was, sorry, I kind of got,
Oh, yeah, no, we were going to talk about the book,
yeah.
and that basically, I mean, I don't think people know, but this is a book of oral tradition stories, but it's
Yeah,
been recorded in a book. So
yeah,
how did that come to be? How did the book come to be? How did we
yeah.
move from that?
Okay, yeah, can I hold your book? Just by the way, there's two versions of the book now. Well, two cover versions. This is the original one, and there's the new and improved version. Just kidding. So yeah, thank you. Uh, how it came about was I met Alex Wolf in the 70s, and we became good friends over the years. And he's older than I. He's maybe 20, 30 years older than me. And he was kind of an old man by then. And he was quite a storyteller. I was so intrigued by the stories that he would tell, like from morning to night, like he's just like he was a classic traditional indigenous storyteller, telling stories all the time. And he used to come over. Finally, I said to him after a few years, Alex, you should write a book. And he says, "Oh no, we don't. No, that's not proper to put these stories in writing. It's got to stay in the oral tradition." And at the end of the day, though, I felt kind of bad, and I still have mixed feelings about it. I talked him into writing the book, and he reluctantly agreed, and then he did think about it a lot, and then he fully agreed, and wholeheartedly agreed that it's a good idea, because his grandchildren were growing up, and they were in different parts of the country. His daughter was over there, and another daughter over there with their kids, and they weren't around to close to him for him to tell the stories to, because it is our tradition, our culture, where the grandfathers and grandmothers pass on the knowledge to our grandchildren through oral tradition, through storytelling. We never had books, so it was through the stories that we passed on this knowledge to our kids. But with the changing world, uh, with the new age upon us, the oral tradition was getting sort of pushed into oblivion, really, and the written tradition dominated everybody's lives. And not only that, but the technology became more pervasive. There's technology in everything. The TVs, the radios, the video games, and all the different things were starting to distract the our kids, our children, from listening to the stories. And so on that count, Alex realized that it's time to commit our stories to the written form. But with the caveat that these stories, we must be, they must continue on in the oral tradition. And we must make it so that the oral tradition and the written tradition, uh, we form an alliance between those two traditions where they can uh, uh, coexist in a reciprocal manner. That the oral tradition supports the written tradition, and the written tradition supports the oral tradition. That's the ideal way. I don't know if we can ever do that, but we can give it a shot and try, and always push for that. And so today, I'm just so happy that you have asked me to come and speak, because you're the first person in the whole world that have approached me about to come and talk about something like this about Alex Wolf. You're opening up a can of worms. No,
Well, I'm happy to do that. So there's so many things that come out of that, but we're going to get back to that. But maybe what I'm going to do is also introduce Andrea here and get her to talk a little bit about her experience with the book and what's happening with it as well.
Okay, well, the first time that I became aware of this book was in an English class I was taking from Athabasca University, was English 308, Indigenous Literature in Canada. So that was the first time I had been aware of the book, and we read the whole book, and we, did work with the book. And then later on, now I'm teaching ELA A30, which is grade 12 English course for adults. And I thought, well, and the focus is Canadian. So I thought, well, I need to begin from the beginning, as in before Canada. And there's a story in this collection called Predictions, where it talks about Earth Elders, people who are camped on a ridge in Saskatchewan, and they are watching the progression of the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway. And it tells this story from the point of view of the people who are watching that railway come towards them. And it talks about the predictions of the elders that first the white men would come in small numbers in the wagons, and that wasn't very frightening at that time. And then later on, it was predicted that they would build this railway, which would have a carriage that looked like a great worm, and many more white men would come and cover the land. And then it finally predicts that many people from many lands will come to the country. But it does it all from the perspective of the Indigenous people who are watching this happen. And it's not, it's an oral history. It's people who are just telling you what they saw and what they thought and what they felt about it. And so to me, that was a really the right way to start the course and put Canada into that perspective, a thing that is happening while people are watching it happen. And I'm so grateful that Alexander Wolf chose to write these stories down, because otherwise they would have been inaccessible for me. It would not have been possible for me to share that story with the students and get my class going in that way if I hadn't been able to use this resource.
well, that's an excellent observation of this tradition, and the way you handled it, the way you approached it, is like well done. And very carefully. You approached it carefully, very respectfully, and that's the way it should be done. And you hit the nail on the head when it comes to approaching it careful, because we were talking earlier that we really don't we're exploring a new area of relationships that we're having between Indigenous and non-Indigenous white communities, and it all has to be kind of figure out how we're going to do it, and so you're that's an awesome example of how it can be done, and carefully and respectfully, and looking at the details of it, considering the details of it.
Do you think Alexander would have anticipated that people would be using his book in that way?
You know, that's a good question because I never thought of it, what you're asking. But what he did say was that, you know, we we have to commit these stories to the written form so that they can be preserved for future generations because we've been overrun and overtaken by all this technology that's creating such a great distraction for our kids. Now we got people on phones, or you're talking to them and they're doing something on their phone, and it's kind of not respectful, but that's what we do today. That's what they do. So technology is just taken over, right? And and I assume it's going to get even more, pervasive. So Alex had to find a way to commit his stories that were told to him uh, to writing because he wanted to continue those stories to continue on into future generations. And what you're doing is you're with your stories in your class, you're actually supporting that aim, that goal, that objective for writing this story. You're doing what he would have wanted to do.
Well, one thing that made that a little bit easier was the preface that you wrote, sort of like describing the tradition and the way it should be used. So somebody who's not versed in it, like me, could read that information and understand how to approach it respectfully. And then also in the introduction that Alex wrote, explaining where the stories came from and the provenance of all the stories and how they came. So then that made it possible for me to feel comfortable that I was doing things respectfully. It erased my ignorance before I started to work with the story itself. So then I was able to also share some of that information with the students to show the students, we have in my class, I have Indigenous students, I have non-Indigenous students who are born and raised in Canada, I have immigrant students, refugee students, foreign students. So we have quite a collection of people who are going to experience this story. So I'm able to share the introduction that you and Alex made so that I can show them how, we can share a story respectfully and how to interpret and understand a story a little bit.
I think part of this is understanding not only the content of the book, but also everything that surrounds it. So one of the other pieces that surrounds this book, because it is now a copyrighted book, and so subject to Canadian copyright as well. So Andrea had actually approached me in my role as a librarian and asked me about the copyright and what she was able to do with it. So in Canada, we have fair dealing. In the US, it's fair use. And based on our policy in Canada, each institution has guidelines in terms of what we can use for copyright. So with a book such as this, we would be able to use, this is the guideline that Sask Polytechnic has currently, we'd be able to use about 10% of the book in a course. And so that was the guideline that I had given you, and that fortunately that met your guidelines in terms of what you wanted to use. So it gets a little bit strange in terms of, we now have sort of the Western protocol and the Western laws that have been put in place, and then we have the oral tradition, which this is moving alongside with. So I mean, I think what we're going to explore today a little bit is how we do that. But before we do that, there was one other little library piece that I thought I'd add in because it's kind of interesting. So Holly Adamson, who's one of our guests today, is going to do a short presentation on some work that's taking place in libraries in Saskatchewan in dealing with this type of resource. I'm wondering if Holly's able to jump in and just do a short presentation here.
Yeah, hi guys. Just give me 1 second. So I'm going to share my screen for a couple of seconds here. You should now see a lovely picture with a pheasant and a lovely QR code and stuff. I am the library system admin at Sask Polytech, and for the last, I think, 5 years, if I counted them correctly, have been working on a project called the Saskatchewan Indigenous Subject Headings Project. Now, this is a provincial project with members from across the province that is headed by the Multi-Type Library Board. And we have come together to work on creating subject headings that make it easier for us to find Indigenous resources and use the words and language Indigenous people living in Saskatchewan would want to use to find these resources. This project has started 5 years ago, but we first started engaging with elders, old ones, and members of different language communities in 2022, that winter. And then in 2023, yes, sorry guys, it's been a year and a half now with this. We first came out with a list of Indigenous subject headings. Now, subject headings are basically hashtags for books that we use in library catalogs to make it more easy to find them. We, as libraries, usually use standardized words, but standardized words don't really work when you're trying to figure out how to catalog a book on Indigenous subject not Indigenous subject headings, Indigenous knowledge. So that is partly what the subject headings covers on it. If you guys have any more questions, feel free to reach out to myself about Indigenous subject headings, or you can check out the Multi-Type Library Board's page on Saskatchewan Indigenous subject headings to learn more. And it's a really great project, and we're currently working on a review session and engaging with communities on that about questions we have about subject headings.
Comment on that?
Absolutely, yeah.
Uh,
Sorry.
That's Holly. That was
Holly.
Holly that was, yeah, giving us that information.
Holly, very good project, excellent project that you're embarking on over the last few years. And I never thought any kind of a project like that could ever exist, because I'm just from the standard, normal, daily world. But when you get into your kind of area of work, that's really important. And of course, it's important for us to recognize headings when we're looking for something. When we're doing internet searches and stuff, I'm always trying to find what a word that would best describe what I'm looking for. Yeah, very good point. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but what I do kind of think is important to be mindful of, to think of, is you know, there are so many language speaking groups there in Canada. Like back, I think if I remember right, there are over 300 or 400 different languages, Indigenous languages spoken in the Americas. And in Canada, there's quite a few different languages. Dene being a unique language unto itself. And I'm from a Soto Cree language groups. Soto is Cree and Ojibwe mixed together. So we have mixtures of languages going on too. And so these are the things to take into account when we're trying to figure out like headings and titles of books and headings for search headings. And I would say, you know, something we need to talk about more and to explore a lot deeper. Take a deeper dive into, in other words.
I think that's what we're discovering, like as we're moving, that's why we're looking at this review, is once we started sort of opening this up and looking at how do we explore this, we realized, yes, there's different languages. Oh, and there's different traditions. And oh, how do we, like, it's actually quite exciting once you start to delve in.
Yeah.
How you can, I mean, previously, I think when we looked at the subject headings, I know being a research librarian, a lot of things were categorized under the subject heading of Indian.
Oh.
Indian culture, Indian tradition. And so it got rather strange when you're looking to assist people with their research and starting to delve into these subjects. And there just wasn't the detail that was involved in it. So that's one of the things with the review now, once we've started moving into this, that there's a lot more that we can use in terms of categorizing that knowledge and assisting people in research going forward. So it's an exciting project, and it's a shift, a big shift in what we're doing. Yeah.
Yeah, and also the issue of I think we just mentioned it. It's using the proper terminology, pronouns, or whatever you want to say, uh, but what's politically correct. And Alex Wolf said, and I totally agree with Danny Musqueam, my adopted dad, has said before in the 80s, you know, these names, titles were given or changed. Well, the first title, Indian, well, that's a federal government. They gave us that. We're Nahio and Cree, and Ojibwe, Anishinaabe. So we have our own names for ourselves that could be used as headings too. But then again, you're looking at how common ground that affects, like a common regular person, like a Ukrainian person coming to have a look at it. Well, they wouldn't know what Anishinaabe means. So these are the things we can talk about, like what's most effective and what's most appropriate to use, and not at the same time get tied down with being politically correct, because we say that it's okay to use Indian. Everything, they're all those indigenous, Aboriginal, native, they're all like interchangeably used, and it's okay. In my books, in other people's books, it may not be okay. So I'm just speaking from my point of view.
So in terms of, this is Open Education Week. And so one of the goals of open education is to really open up resources like this or other books so that they're more accessible to students. So I had talked about how Andrea was able to use a certain percentage of this book based on copyright and what we have access to. In terms of open education, books can be openly licensed so that they can become, the whole book can become accessible. But part of that is also it can then be copied and reused and adapted and possibly commercialized. So there's a lot of the concepts that come up in open education that may not be fully compatible with those traditions and those protocols. So maybe we can just do a little bit of an exploration of how well these things might fit together. So in terms of the idea of openness and making things accessible to people, would you say that that's sort of how would that fit with the protocols that you might have used for more traditional knowledge?
Well, first of all, nowadays, in modern times, these books, Earth Elder Stories, and the other book my wife wrote, which I published, called The Seven Fires, and they're being used at various universities and places in academia. But I've learned, to my horror, no, I'm exaggerating, but that they're being copied, photocopied. The books are being photocopied and used, and there's some that have been photocopied and posted on the internet. So the copyright, I believe, is being infringed on in that respect, where the book is now becoming available to the public. And that's a problem that not only I am concerned with, but the whole publishing industry's concerned about that. All the authors, all the artists, all the musicians that create music, their royalties are shrinking. So that's something we need to talk more about. And the other thing is that Alex Wolf once said, and I think it's written in his book, he said, stories and songs. Songs are just as important as stories. Stories and songs belong to individuals. And some of these songs and stories that these individuals have are that's their responsibility in the family, in the clan, to remember those stories and to pass those stories on within the family, so future generations will remember where they came from and their history. But there's also stories that are their family stories, and there are community stories that belong to that community. So if you want a story that belongs to the community, you got to go to the community and get permission. Get permission from the individual or the family or the community to take those stories and retell them. And it's very similar to the modern Western copyright system, and don't plagiarize, type of thing in university. So that's sort of kind of in a nutshell.
So all the stories within this book then were stories that belonged to Alexander. Some of them were family stories, but
Yeah.
he had been given responsibility to hold them and to communicate them.
Yeah. And in fact, he was given permission to write those stories.
Okay.
Yeah.
Tell us more about that. How did that happen?
Well, he had like I've known him for years. When I knew him, he just had like a library full of stories, like just a huge body of stories. But he only used the ones that were specific to him, that was told to him, his family. These are family stories that were told to him. But he knows, he knew many other stories that he told me. I'd asked him, Alex, why don't you write that? That's a really interesting story. He says, no, I don't have permission to write that story. I'm just writing what I have permission to write. So he's very specific. Like he could have wrote like a book that thick, 400 pages. But he decided this is what he wanted to give to the public. And this is for the public. So he published them for all to read and all to, But it's a good idea to always consider the oral tradition protocols and in terms of the written tradition protocols, the written tradition rules of thumb, like copyright rules, and oral tradition rules, and how they may compare and be mutually supportive, and how there may be some differences. So, and we try our hardest to maintain the integrity of the story itself, to not misinterpret the story. However, when we do tell a story in the English language, a lot of the meaning and a lot of the nuances, a lot of many things are lost in the translation when it's told. This is told in Solo at first. That's the first language that story belongs to, that first language, and it belongs to the culture of that language. And no, so the way that language is developed over the thousands of years was best describes those events and the worldview. And to tell it now, to change it and translate it to English, a lot of it's taken away. For example, one aspect of the language structure is it has in our traditional languages, we have the physical aspect of the language. And then above that language, there's the spiritual aspect. So the Soto language or the Cree language describes both the physical and spiritual aspects of life, of our reality, of how we see the world and how we interact within the world. and how we develop our relationships. We say a word that has a double meaning, you might say. Not a double meaning that's contradictory, but a double meaning that supports one another to have a deeper understanding of what you're looking at or what you're seeing. So that's the spiritual aspect is taken out of it when you translate it to English. And Alex Wolf says you take the guts out of it, basically. When you translate it, you take the guts out of it.
You had a lot of good discussions with him, didn't you?
Oh, deep. But at the same time, the reality of it all is these stories have to be committed, he felt, to English and written form. And a lot of the meaning has been sacrificed. But you got to try your hardest to retain the meaning. And that's where the introductions, like at the beginning of each story, has a little blurb there, establishing, setting up the story, what it's about, and he mentions the spiritual aspect of the story. We always have to emphasize the spiritual aspect of our oral tradition. That should not be left out. There's the spiritual element to it, and it's hard to and even in academia, we want to sort of stay away from the spiritual aspect. But the reality is, that's who we are. We're physical and spiritual, and that's what these stories acknowledge and support. And everything that comes out of all these stories are designed to express that spiritual reality.
So I'm a little bit later, I'm going to be asking for some tips for instructors. And it's hard. Spiritual tips seems like that's, those concepts don't fit well together. But right now, I'm really interested, Harvey. You were really the advocate here with both Alexander and with Danny Musqua, asking them to take things that were oral tradition and to create a book out of them. So what was it that you saw that made you that advocate that was encouraging them to do this?
Well, I have to I have to really, acknowledge my wife, Diane Knight, who had a big part of this advocacy, I guess. It's because she helped write these stories. Well, Alex Wolf actually wrote these stories himself by hand. We
Okay.
bought an old Remington typewriter back then. That's all that existed. We had no computers.
People won't know what
Ting,
that
ting,
is
ting, ting, ting.
necessarily.
Remington. Google it. But Remington is like with the big type, we bought one for Alex Wolf. Well, he was tick, 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 typing away. He typed a few stories on it, but he actually hand wrote, and I still have the manuscripts. And he and Diane typed them in, and Diane and I also did the work of editing the stories and making sure that the story they were grammatically correct and everything. And I should point out one of the big things I feel I made a big mistake in advocating for these stories to be in written form, to be put in written form, is that when he wrote these stories, this is interesting. He wrote everything in the present tense. Present tense. And I asked Alex, why everything it is, and there's no was, it's all happening right now. And he said, well, it is happening right now when I'm telling it, and that's the whole point of oral tradition. It's a reenactment of events that happened in the past. And it's a reenactment is retelling the story. It's reenacting the story. It's like Chaucer, it's like you're on stage. You're retelling the story, but you're reenacting it, and you're creating this, you're bringing this historical event to the present. You're unfolding it into the present time. And so there's no was. And there's no will be. There's just the here and now. What's happening right now. The history's happening right now. The future's happening right now. That type of thing. So it's a philosophy that's kind of hard to wrap my mind around. Still working on it, but it is what it is, I guess.
So I had mentioned, well, maybe before we jump in and sort of ask for some suggestions for instructors, I'm wondering if there's any questions that have come up in the chat. I'm just going to check in here. Do you see anything, Matthew or Holly, that we need to, we could ask?
So
Harvey?
we've had some lovely engagements in the chat. Shelley just mentioned that Alex was correct. The story's writings are happening now as we read them. So the present tense is correct. And I believe Shelley is an English teacher. So, you know, great on her. Linda, who says she is from Fishing Lake First Nation, is a teacher on Regina campus. From her understandings and teachings, there are stories like the creation stories that are about spirit. So she won't talk about them in classes that are taught in the fall because we don't tell those stories unless it's winter. And has a lovely long little thing in there. But from that, I actually have a question is how do we, as educators, people that have, these stories may have been published inappropriately and whatnot, are there ways for us to keep that stuff published and in our libraries, but still respect the teachings of putting a note on it, or any ways of dealing with that type of stuff when stories have been published and should only be told in winter, but I can pick up a book anytime.
Good point. Before I go there, I just wanted to finish this little story I was telling with Alex Wolf, our conundrum, I guess, of trying to figure out how we're going to write this story and publish it into a book. And these questions were raised. The questions you're raising right now we raised back then about how it's going to be done and what's respectful and what may not be. So I did eventually convert his past tense words like was and did and what happened to its happening, from walk to walking, from walking to walked, he walked up the hill, and I felt kind of a little, like bad about that. And I told Alex, I said, look, I feel really bad about converting all your words, past tense words, into present tense words. He says, that's okay. We're committing this to the oral tradition. Let's just do it the way in accordance with the rules of the written tradition. So that's what we did, and that's the way it is. But as you mentioned, that somebody was saying, when you are actually reading the story, you're bringing it to life. It's a reenactment, and then it's really a good idea to keep these differences in mind, though, historically and in a cultural sense, that or our language is it's a dynamic, fluid language that are languages that are expressed in the present tense. The words are present tense expressions. And that's something that, language people might be interested in looking at, and they probably have. But it's understanding that reality of oral tradition and storytelling is told in the present tense and brought. So it was it's a reenactment, basically, and that has to do with everything. That our ceremonies are reenactments, and that has to do with everything we do,
So in terms of the question about seasonal stories.
Oh,
I'm
yeah,
wondering if you have any sort of suggestions or ideas, because there would be seasonal stories probably within the collection as well.
yeah. Well, that's something to consider. That's important to respect the seasonal stories like Wasaki Chuck is a story of our one of our cultural heroes, I guess, or what would you call mythological heroes. But it was actually, again, Wasaki Chuck really does exist in according to our concept, our worldview. But he's considered in the Western world as a mythological character. But Wasaki Chuck is a story that you can tell anytime, any season. But it's mostly told in summer. And then there's the story, of course. Maybe I'm wrong. Was it Wasaki Chuck that's only told? I want to ask that guest there. Is it wintertime
Don't
story?
know.
Wasaki Chuck? I'm asking one of the guests here.
Yeah, we can see if they'll give us some feedback on that. for
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
I think the one from Regina, I think, was mentioning that. But there are stories. There's stories we have like Wheatigo, Windigo. These are stories that are only told in winter too, because the character existed in wintertime and not in the summertime. So there are certain stories that can only be told, and if they're not published, I'm sure if they go into too much into the spiritual zone, you don't want to tell them in public. It's like, it's an example of there's a place and time for those stories. They're ceremonial stories that are only told in the sweat lodge, or only told in a ceremonial setting, or only in a chicken dance or a certain ceremony. And so there are many different types of stories that we have to, be mindful of, that categories of stories. And that's diving pretty deep into our culture when you start looking at all the variations of types of stories and how they are used and how they're told. But this book Alex Wolf was given the public permission to utilize, to tell these stories, to share these stories, and so that they preserved and for the future generations.
I think maybe one of the biggest tensions right now would be, so what I'm hearing is that the copyright actually works well, just in terms of how it protects the stories.
Yes.
But I mean, things fall out of copyright. They go into public domain. And currently in Canada, that would be 70 years after the death of the author. But from what you're telling me, these stories are timeless, really. Like they're, Alexander might have chosen to publish his book, but the stories he's told might always be deserving of some sort of protection. There should never be a point where they become public stories accessible to anybody to revise or change or monetize the way they want. And that might be one of the difficulties in terms of having that copyright applied to First Nations knowledge or First Nations stories.
Yeah.
Is that a question? I think it's a question.
A rhetoric question.
It is a rhetoric question.
No, it's a very good question. That's a loaded question. I have to break it down, unpack it a little bit. Yeah, that is really something that we have to really, really, examine more deeply.
Sorry.
People are not, people have, what was the question again? Sorry.
Well, I think it's around just the question that the stories continue to deserve protection. Even like typically the Western copyright tradition is that there becomes a period where they're
right.
now open to the public to have access to revise, change, monetize the way they want. But these stories, that may not be appropriate.
Public domain.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Well, let's look at Elvis Presley. His music, I believe, is public domain now, eh? But how many people make it their own? and say, this music was created by Harvey Knight. When actually Elvis actually sang it, but everybody knows it was Elvis. So nobody's gonna. So I'm thinking kind of that kind of thing where, there's just kind of just uh, a mode of respect, of acknowledging uh, the authors of these teachings, or the origins of these teachings. And Alex Wolf, in his book, there's a list of his sources there, and we made sure to put it in the Seven Fires book, where there's a list of his grandfathers and grandmothers, his sources. It's always important to remember the sources, and I think I've come across that in Western literature, where uh, so and so begat so and so and begat, and so said to so and so, like going through the generations, acknowledging past generations for the source of knowledge. Well, it's the same thing applies here. And the best we can do is that we use Western laws and traditions of copyright to protect indigenous oral tradition stories, whereas the oral tradition stories as well we have to work harder to bring our rules and regulations that govern our traditions out, and that's what we have to study and examine. And this is what we're doing here today. We're looking at some of the protocols and rules and traditions, policies, I guess, my traditional policies, if that's what can be used, that apply in our oral tradition. And if we could bring them up to, it is a very important thing we have to look at.
We're running out of time here, and this conversation, I think, could well carry on
Yeah.
for an hour, but we will lose our audience. So we may carry on here, and if others want to carry and continue to listen in, they can. I'm going to ask both of you the same question. So I'm just wondering, in terms of actually providing some tips or some suggestions to instructors, if they want to incorporate some of these stories, if they fit within their curriculum. Andrea, maybe you would have a couple suggestions as well that you could make in terms of you've actually thought very deeply, I think, about how you're using the stories and where it's appropriate. So I'm just wondering if you had some suggestions from your own experience.
Well, as I mentioned before, I am mostly non-Indigenous, not completely non-Indigenous, but I don't have that wealth of background. So I really had to rely on the preface in the information that both Harvey and Alex provided inside the text to make sure that I set it up for the students so they would understand it was coming from a good place, so that the Indigenous students would see that it was coming from a good place, respecting a tradition that they probably know very well, or they may or may not know very well, and also introducing it to other students who may not be so familiar with it. So I really relied on that information to be respectful and to present the story in a good way. So I made sure that I prepared well in advance. Don't know what else I could say.
Well,
That's about it.
Very. I totally. I think that's really awesome that you're referring to the details set out in the introduction and the preface, because I think that was what we're trying to. That was what the objective of those two parts are, to try to sort of set out some guidelines, and you picked up on all the things you needed to pick up to present these stories as best as you could, and according to those. But there's much more to it than just that, just what we put in there. There's much more to it, and studying and further will require further study, and we have to really look at our oral tradition in a more detailed way, and look at all the various dimensions of it, and bring to light those dimensions, and bring them out, because, as I said, the oral tradition is a product of our thinking and language systems that are both physical and spiritual, of physical and spiritual nature, of physical and spiritual reality. We can't do justice to one or the other without the other. They have to go together, hand in hand. And it doesn't mean to go in, you have to just do it in ceremonies, but we're in your classroom. You can have ceremonies and stuff in your classroom where you can maybe have a tip would be have a smudge and before you tell the stories, before you share the stories, because that'll help. Once you have that smudge, that'll help you. It'll open up the door to the spirit world, and there you can be more deeply inspired to say something or to be enlightened by something, and then you can contribute to the discussion. So a little smudge goes a long ways, type of thing. And it's okay to do it in the classroom. We do it where I work in prison every day. We have smudging rooms, but they're specifically designed for ventilated and stuff for smudging. So.
The one tip that I would make is I think one of the challenges is when we take a book which is not in the original language, so we lose something there, which may not be in the correct tense all the time, or there's other issues with it, and we're taking it into our classroom to show to our students. So I think one of the tips that I would pass along is that Sask Polytech is doing a lot to invite our instructors and our students into that First Nations understanding as well, in terms of hosting a powwow every year, in terms of having Indigenous student centers on campus that would invite people to participate with students in different activities that are taking place. And in terms of our ILDC, our leadership division, which is providing opportunities to sit in on talks and presentations by different First Nation speakers, such as we've done today. So it's not just inviting them into our classroom; it's also going out into their world and understanding better by participating in First Nations activities as well. So I want to thank both of the guests here today. Clearly, this is an ongoing conversation, and I hope we can find other ways of continuing this conversation and inviting more people in. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.